just wanted to first express gratitude that all of you have made it to here, taken the time, the effort to be here. And for the next 28 minutes, this will be more like a show. We're gonna really have some fun. And I'm excited personally because I was thinking about angles that would fit into the themes of art and, geometrical patterns and everything in here. And I'm gonna make a literal elixir of life. We're gonna make the philosopher's stone. And this is something that's pretty much spoken in these circles as upgrading things. But I think this is also what we're gonna do today. In alchemy, the first thing that we start with is the materials. And as Sean said, it's not just the ingredients, it's not just the labels. And for me now, for almost 15 years, it's been a journey to connect more with the things behind the ingredients. So I started with the supplements and everything, and it ended up now being really enthusiastic about farming, about the soil, about foraging, hunting, fishing, all of these things. Because then you actually get to know the organism that you are working with. So in essence, we are, at the end of the day, eating living body parts of animals, insects, fungi, whatever. But yeah, I brought some of my favorite ingredients right now. They are highly linked into the other aspects that you hear today and already heard about turmeric, about bilberries, about reishi mushroom. And I'm not going to go into that much of a detail about benefits. I'm going to give more of a ethnobotanical or cultural angle to these things, and then we're going to actually make a pretty solid drink. In Western alchemy, the process has 4 stages. And we're going to go through these, and I'm going to link the ingredients into the process. And of course, let's say like Carl Jung had all of these same ideas, whether it was in the first phase, work with your shadow and all of these things. But today we're going to link it more into the actual philosopher's stone. But at the end of the day, the rubedo should be the great work, the essence, the philosopher's stone. And the first thing that I'm going to start with is one of my teachers. I wrote a book on chaga mushroom a bit over a decade ago. And this is a black material. And I found it very fascinating that the first phase in alchemical process is to basically burn the stuff down. That's the dark night of the soul archetype. But we're going to start with the black materials, and then we're going to go through this whole process into the redness. In alchemy, this is the gold stuff. It's actually red, the color. In the eastern side of, let's say, alchemy in the broader spectrum of things, the idea was basically to transmutate the Jing energy into the Shen. And I also put there some other words, because in Ayurveda, in Indian traditions, the ojas, that's the same idea. In Western science, we call it the HPA axis, basically the same hormonal system that they mapped out thousands of years ago. There are certain foods, certain ingredients that basically help you with the potential. That's the stearin in the candle. That's the ability to go when you don't have energy. That's passed genetically from your ancestors. And that's where we need material. That was an old Taoist concept, that you need the material into your system. You can play around with prana and chi and do qigong and yoga and all of this stuff, but you need the actual herbs to get that stuff, that material into your instrument. And I like, yesterday we were speaking about sisu, and that's the exact concept in Finnish language. It's almost like metaphysical aspect of being able to go. And some of these herbs that we are going to use today, like reishi mushroom, is specifically for the Shen, for the aura. So the candle has that potential, then the energy that's moving, that's burning, that's the prana, that's the chi, and then it has this basically aura that it creates, and that's the spiritual aspect of things. So two sides of the things, but we start with chaga mushroom. And one of the concepts, if I think about botanicals and longevity, is that many of the most interesting substances are long organisms, long-living organisms. In the case of chaga, that mushroom can be growing there for 20 years, 30 years. And it's the same idea with, let's say, ginseng root or what have you. It can be 100 years old. So the idea that the plant is also more intelligent when it has some years around the sun produces more interesting chemistry than annual plants. But we start with that, and that is the black material. And in Russia especially, this has been long regarded as one of the primary longevity herbs, and mainly due its ability to lower inflammation in the gut. Really good prebiotic, one of the highest antioxidant fungi that we have, due to the fact that it fights off all of these things around itself. So that chromogenic complex, that black stuff, is really high in certain terpenes, really high in phenolic compounds. And that's the base, quite a lot of the material that we are going to use to help to soothe the gut, and by that affect the immune system. One of the most interesting herbs for the immune system, due to beta-glucans and all of these other goodies that basically teach your immune system to work smarter. Immunomodulatory effects. Then I added in some ginger. Sean was also talking about this, and all of these subtle oils, especially ginger oils and these types of things, are really good also for anti-inflammatory effects. And the whole category of turmeric, ginger, galangal root, this family of plants is really good for longevity because these are kind of overall tonifying herbs that also help the gut. And one of the key ideas in herbalism is that you have these, let's say, harmonizing or amplifying herbs always with the key herb. So licorice or ginger or something like that basically helps the stuff get in deeper. And then comes something special. I've done these solo vision quest into the wilderness of Lapland for many years now. I take a chopper that drops me off in the middle of nowhere. I go there fasting, fishing, all types of things. And over the years, there have been, let's say, experiences in quite altered states that had deep impact on me, how I see certain plants. And rhodiola is actually grown in the Lapland natively. It's a wild plant there. And a few years back, I met this one plant. It's very interesting when you're completely exhausted and kind of empty. That's the whole base of the blackness and that idea that you're burning yourself off. It's an old shamanic tradition, just fasting, going on a vision quest. And then I met this one rhodiola plant. And I basically had this feeling that I need to ask permission to even approach it. And it's a very interesting because these are wild ideas that you hear somewhere, but I feel kind of scared. But at the end of the day, I ended up harvesting that plant and made a tincture out of it. Then I added in some ashwagandha. That's, of course, in Ayurvedic tradition, in India, the #1 herb for everything, for longevity, like a Swiss army knife, goes for everything. And that my homegrown ashwagandha root also took a couple of years, put it in here, and then added in some of the best vanilla that I found from Madagascar. And this has been sitting for a few years now. I was supposed to find a good place for it to be used, and we're going to do it today. So again, you can find all kinds of rhodiola supplements and whatnot, but this is something special because I think the intention behind something really matters. That's why if you grow your own food, whatever, there's more love, whatever, it affects the whole psycho-spiritual process, how you actually absorb and how that stuff affects you. And at the end of this presentation, I don't know, we're going to have some type of lottery. The whole drink will be going to someone or somewhere, let's see. But I definitely want to also take a sip of that. Anyhow, somebody will get it. And that's also a key idea, going back to the roots. That's the old idea that if you look at like tree, most of the plant is actually underground. That's the nervous system of the plant. That's why most of the longevity herbs are roots. Let's say ginseng root, rhodiola, ashwagandha, many of these things, even turmeric, these are roots because they also produce these subtle oils that are really good for your nervous system, protecting nervous system. And then as the final part of this first phase, we add in some cacao. And as you can see there, it's not just the brown, but it's actually this really nice purple color. That's the opened up cacao bean. And that was the center of the medicine wheel in the Southern America and in Central America. And that has been used as a drug enhancer. I remember listening Jonathan Auth, who's one of the most prolific writers around the psychedelics and ethnopharmacological aspects of Amazonian plants, that this was the key thing that the Mayans and the Aztecs and the Olmecs used to carry all of the other ingredients into your system. Like the first magic mushroom servings for cordon voisin by Maria Sabina were served with cacao. And this is a key idea. Sean was also talking about these methylxanthines, these xanthine alkaloids that basically open up your system, whether it was caffeine, whether it was theobromine in cacao, but that's more for our cardiovascular system. And that's what we are going to do next. Kind of open up the system, get the circulation going, and all of the other goodies are going deeper into your system. And I'm going to share the exact recipe at the end, so don't worry, you're not going to be able to make this at home. But I also put some cacao paste, not just cacao powder, but kind of the 100% cold-pressed cacao. This particular cacao comes from Ecuador, and those were pre-made at our chocolate factory. And the next phase is the whitening or clarifying the process. And I want to take time to also emphasize that we put a lot of focus on the foods that we eat. But for me, over the years, one of the core ideas, almost at the elemental level, is to connect more with the water. And it's not just cold plunges and Wim Hof and all of this, but spring water. So we understand the concept of wild foods, like the difference between some salad and nettle. But there is a difference between regular water and wild water. And we're going to use stuff that comes from Haukkala Spring near Jyväskylä area in the central Finland to represent the whitening or purifying the process. That's what teaches flow. And that's been my journey also, putting some effort into actually getting into the source, getting the water from there. And yeah, there are the beneficial bacteria and gas form minerals and all that goodies that are not present in conventional water. But just want to point out that there are levels to many things that are actually, like in this case, 60-70% of your body. That's what's forming your bloodstream in essence, your blood. And for me, let's say as a spiritual concept, there is a difference if the water is actually coming from the source. Okay, now we have that one in. Then we go to the yellowness. And this is often linked with inflammation. Many of the foods that represent this yellowness in itself are really good for inflammation in general. But one of the key concepts for longevity is that back in the years, I looked more into beekeepers. And there is pretty solid evidence that they live longer than, let's say, the same age-grouped people nearby. And you can speculate whether it was that they got stung by the bees all the time or what's the reason. But I think one of the key ideas is that they eat some of this very special stuff that bees are producing. Not just the honey, but we have now honey with royal jelly. And that's the stuff that's actually a good example of epigenetics, because they start to feed this stuff to the worker bees that then turn into queen bee. So the nutritional input actually changes the expression of genetics drastically. But let's put some honey and the yellow part with royal jelly. Then I'm gonna also put in some curcumin for the color pigments. This is pretty much the core idea here, that many of the compounds that you can speak in fancy terms are actually color pigments in the food. Whether it was the catechins in the cacao, whether it was anthocyanins in the bilberries, they are color pigments that are actually geometrically in different forms. And that boils down also that we're basically getting more interesting geometrical patterns into our instrument, and that is kind of harmonizing the whole system. Yeah, they work as antioxidants and basically work as an anti-rusting agents at the cellular level. For curcumin, I actually think that many people just link it to inflammation, but it's more specifically inflammation in the brain. Most solid studies are for depression, for brain health, not just for the joints and other tissues. And then also one of those things that you probably haven't heard, but this is interesting for me because before basically the Earth's atmosphere was this thick, there was more radiation coming through, and these microalgae didn't just photosynthesize and produce chlorophyll, but also produced phycocyanin, which is blue pigment. And this is very hard to find in nature. We see many things as a color of blue, but this is actual blue color. And the structure behind this, if you look at it, is pretty harmonized. And this is basically an extract of spirulina or blue-green algae. And that is something that we're going to add to the mixture to get the whole spectrum of colors in here to really lower the inflammation and make the philosopher's stone. And yeah, these are really good for protecting the glial cells in your nervous system and many specific things. Then for the texture of the drink, because this is also important. I don't just want to put all the goodies here and then it's weird and too watery and all that. I ran elixir bars for years in Tampere area, and there are a few components that we are putting also for that region. And again, this could be called, let's say, extremophiles. These plants that grow in an environment that is really harsh, and it basically pressurizes the plants to produce more interesting chemistry. That's the case with rhodiola. That's the case with cordyceps or maca root or whatever. And in bilberries, for example, the whole berry is filled with these anthocyanins, rather than in blueberries, where there is 8 times less amount of these because they are only on the surface of the berry. So we put those in, get the pectin, get the structure there, and then, of course, few of the more normal things. Olive oil is definitely linked into longevity, and I have an unfiltered olive oil, which is also pretty special. If you can find that, it's much more high, richer in these polyphenols, oleuropein, all of these goodies. And then avocado. This is also for the texture. So I think that the mouthfeel also matters, how it feels in your mouth. And now we're getting the, let's say, body of this drink really going. And of course, there are a lot of things in avocados also that are good for you, glutathione and folate and all of these, let's say, more basic things. And, oh, damn. It's always weird when you don't have the exactly ripest avocados ever. That's why I had 3 of them in here. But we're gonna make it. It's hard to talk at the same time when you're multitasking. Yes. Olives are good for your skin also. And I think the case with olives is also that they are old trees. And that's a very different thing than some of these annual plants that produce oils. Something to think about. And then the final part. That's basically putting it all together. And for me, there are a few cool things that I also think about. As I said, if you look at the plants, how are their life cycles going? And every time that I've been into the Amazon, the local shamans have basically gotten me into the trees, the tree barks. That's their medicine. Because those are old organisms that are smarter in essence. They're better chemists. They need to protect the bark, especially from all kinds of things. And in Finland, we had this one guy like 50 years ago, when there was still like our shamanism around, that started to make this really cool pine bark extract. And that's what we're gonna use to kind of finish off. The color is really nice in redness. And that's the key idea. These pycnogenol and other compounds are probably more well known to people, but this comes from the western coast of Finland and is one of those things that people just have been using for a long time for cancer and seems to work for some people. And then reishi mushroom or lingji, that's the spirit mushroom, one of the most highly regarded herbs in the Chinese medicine, but grows all over the world. And we're gonna finish off with Kappa Healths. They are here somewhere. I didn't have the time to actually visit the expo area that much. But now we're gonna add the fat-soluble compounds. There are the terpenes on top of that mushroom. And we are not getting that much out of those with this chaga decoction. So we're boiling it with water and extracting the water-soluble compounds out. But we also want to add in some of the goodies that are fat-soluble. So the point being with the pine bark, that these are the oldest living plants that we have. Almost 5,000 years old, some of these pine species. So that's been my journey also, that I've come to appreciate more of the trees around us. And not just for their beauty and the cognitive ergonomy and everything that they provide, the phytoncides, the oils that we breathe in and it affects our nervous system, but also them as medicine. So the bark needs to protect the plant, and that's the case with cinnamon, many other barks that we use. But to put it all together, there we have the basic fruit smoothie that everybody is drinking early in the morning. And the point wasn't, sea salt. That's the final step. The point was to have some fun, show that you can actually also use things that are not extracts and supplements. So I still, even though I have all of these goodies around me all the time, I still make this chaga tea or infusion just by boiling it in the water because it has a really nice flavor. I like the kind of habit of using that as a base liquid, whether it was for your bulletproof coffee or whatever. So just to have some fun, share some ideas, and let's finish with the salt and the mercury and all of the alchemical processes are coming together. And now we are blending the Philosopher's Stone. Ei, mä laitan ne isoihin pulkkeihin ja sitten ne voi alkoa vaikka seuraavaksi kauan aikana. Ei tarjota sitä. Let's see. I think I did this like 300 years ago in a similar event, and after. Yeah. I already feel it.